Hello, everybody. Thanks for being with us today for today's webinar. I'm going to just take a few moments to let people come into the webinar. And just to start, I have an announcement on some upcoming webinars that we have with COEH. Next week on Wednesday, August 19th, we have our ergonomics webinar. This is going to be a split presentation with the University of Michigan ERC, both on the use of exoskeletons and robotics in ergonomics. And that's going to be on Wednesday, August 19th from 12 to 1 Pacific time. And then our next ergonomics webinar is going to be on Wednesday, September 16th, 12 to 1 Pacific time, with Jacqueline Hannon talking about sensors in understanding performance and safety in healthcare. Also with the University of Michigan ERC. And then the third webinar that I wanted to talk about is in collaboration with CCRON, which is the Occupational Health Nursing Group in Northern California. This one's a bit different. It's for folks working in workers' compensation and occupational health nurses. It's on Thursday, October 8th from 6:30 p.m. to 7:45 Pacific time, so a bit different timing than we usually do. And it's on red flags in common orthopedic conditions, avoiding disasters and optimizing outcomes for injured workers. You can always find out more at coh@berkeley.edu/webinars. And now for today's webinar, I just wanted to thank everybody for being here and showing your support as part of the Industrial Hygiene webinar series. I'm excited to introduce our speaker for When Home Becomes the Exposure Environment, a multi-layered investigation to minimize airborne molds. Just a few housekeeping items first. You will be muted during this presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen in the toolbar. We'll save time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. And we also have the chat open, so feel free to introduce yourself, use the chat to start a discussion. We'll be monitoring that for any info that you all put in there. This presentation is recorded and will be made available on the COEH YouTube page within 5 business days. And our presenter has also made her slides available, so feel free to email us at coehce@berkeley.edu to get the slide deck for today. All participants who logged in with their registration email for the full live presentation today will receive an email tomorrow with a link to an evaluation form. And once you fill out that evaluation form, you will also be able to get your certificate worth 1 continuing education contact hour. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Judith Arthur. Judith Arthur is a third-year PhD candidate in industrial hygiene at the University of Cincinnati, where she trains in aerosol and exposure science under Dr. Sripriya Nanu Shankar. Her research spans combustion simulations of secondhand smoke, evaluations of combined exposure control strategies, and investigations of bioaerosol transmission and mitigation, including MRSA or methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Judith, I'll hand it over to you and I'll stop sharing my screen. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me and thanks for that introduction. I hope everybody can hear me. Just a moment.
Yes, you sound great, Judith. If anybody's having issues with audio, feel free to message me.
Well, good evening, everybody, and you're warmly welcome to today's webinar. I'm sharing an interesting residential investigation titled When Home Becomes the Exposure Environment, a multi-layered investigation to minimize airborne mold. Ordinarily, our homes are supposed to be places of comfort and then safety. And so it's quite alarming when these environments act as sources of exposure or opens us up to adverse health effects. Now, for us as industrial hygienists and environmental scientists, determining whether remediation actually impacted indoor air quality is sometimes challenging. And so in the next few minutes, I'm going to share with you a family's journey, our investigation into this residential home, our interventions that we applied, and post-remediation activities that we carried out. I'm also going to demonstrate how our integrated sampling method provided a better picture to enable us understand and evaluate the overall mold burden and also evaluate our intervention. Now, before I walk you through the investigation, I want us to look at this issue on a larger perspective. Now, indoor moisture and mold is actually common than we want to admit. And so here in the States, nearly half of our homes, specifically about 47% of US homes, have issues with moisture and then mold, either arising from condensation issues, relative humidity issues, or flooding issues, or most especially leakages either from our roofing or from plumbing works. Now, what this does is that it creates an atmosphere or an environment that promotes the growth of mold either on our surfaces or on building materials. Now, once mold establishes its presence, you have fragments and spores being populated in the indoor space and increases our likelihood of infection and opens us up to asthma, allergic rhinitis, wheezing, or coughing. Now, as it stands now, currently, about 4.6 million of asthma cases are attributable to actually indoor moisture and the mold. And it's quite unfortunate that children are most vulnerable because their immune system is still being developed or their respiratory system is still being developed. Now, beyond the health aspect of this exposure to indoor mold has significant impact on a country's economy in that annually billions of US dollars, is invested either in healthcare or in lost production or in remediation activity. Now, together, we come to see how something as simple or as very little as indoor moisture or mold can actually escalate to become an indoor problem or a public health concern. Now, before I walk you through activities, the question to ask is, how much is too much mold? Or more specifically, do we have any exposure limit for indoor mold? Quite unfortunately, as it stands now, I'll say no, or should I say not yet. Unlike other chemicals where we have exposure limits for them, when it comes to bioaerosols in general, especially mold, we don't seem to have any OSHA permissible exposure limits or NIOSH recommended exposure limits or ACGI ATLVs, okay? And there are several reasons one could postulate to try and then explain this. But then we are just going to concentrate on two main reasons. The first one has to do with our individual susceptibility, okay? Meaning that when we take two people and we give them the same exposure, we will all react differently. And so if you took a baby or a child or a young adult and a senior citizen and you kept them in one room and expose them to the same thing, they'll all react differently. And so because of this, it kind of makes it quite difficult to have that universal one single digit that will protect us entirely. Also, pre-existing conditions like asthma or probably chronic obstructive pulmonary disease can also impact this. So assuming somebody already had asthma or other underlying conditions, then putting that person or a seemingly healthy person in that same environment wouldn't be a good reflection, okay? Because then they would tend to react faster than somebody without any underlying condition. And so it kind of make it very difficult to have that unified exposure limit. The second has to do with how we lack standardized sampling method. As it stands now, we all have different techniques and methods to assess or investigate contaminations. And each method that we try and then employ provide your own unique line of evidence regarding the contamination we are interested in investigating. So again, it comes to the same point. It makes it kind of hard to have that single exposure unit. Now we'll quickly look at events that led a family to us. So in early spring, this is where the story begins. So once upon a time, in early spring, specifically around February, a mother and a daughter living in a two-story single-family unit here in Cincinnati encountered a problem. I mean, the problem was more for the daughter than for the mother. The daughter had respiratory issues, and they reported to the hospital. They were treated and discharged. But then the mother realized that the daughter continuously exhibited the symptoms. And being educated as she was quick to say that could my environment actually contribute to whatever my daughter is experiencing? So what did she do? She contracted a third party to do a home assessment of the indoor air. And your guess is as good as mine. The assessment came back and there were high concentrations of mold, particularly in the bathroom and in the bedroom, where very much high concentrations in the bedroom. Because of this, result, it led to further investigation, and they realized that the underlying problem was actually an issue of moisture, something we've previously discussed. So they tore the bathroom down. Basically, the bathroom went a remodeling, but in the process, they had to relocate to allow room for further investigations. So after the time we went in, the walls had been torn to expose any leakages. They had actually fixed all the leakages that they determined. They had fixed or changed the HVAC system. Now, before they could put things together, that was when they invited us. Now, the purpose of our visit wasn't to confirm that mold was an issue, because this had already been confirmed by the initial assessment group. So we went in to answer three basic questions. The first question was remediation successful? Now, this remediation, we are not talking about any hardcore remediation. It was just the basic things that they did. The fixing of the leakages from the roof and then the plumbing works, changing HVAC filters and all that. We wanted to find out whether this little, activities actually impacted the overall mold concentration. The second bit was to find out what mold still remained. And then our third assessment was to look at, or to answer this question, can multiple assessment tools provide a complete picture? We actually see, this is where we see the opportunity to introduce our 24-hour control, which we will later know. So to actually answer this question, we adopted three integrated methods to help us kind of adequately evaluate the problem at hand. And so to quantify the total airborne concentration, we relied on the GRIM. Now, the GRIM is a real-time aerosol instrument, okay, that is able to give us information regarding the concentration. And it's also able to give us size-resolved distribution data. So to quantify total airborne, we relied on the GRIM, and that was our first method. Now, our second method involved the use of the Instascope. But then, unlike the GRIM, the Instascope uses a laser-induced fluorescence to characterize airborne biological particles based on their optical signatures. And then the third approach looked at as sampling using the spore trap. Thus, we collected airborne fungal spores on a sampling cassette for microscopic identification and enumeration. Now, together, this formed the basis of our assessment. Now I'm going to walk you through how we conducted our investigation. So your guess is as good as mine. Our investigation just looked or focused on two sampling areas, the bedroom and then the bathroom. Why? Because these were the areas that recorded the highest concentrations. Okay. So the first thing was basically it served as our baseline assessment, or yeah, our baseline assessment for which subsequent data could be compared to. So on the first day, we recorded the total aerosol concentration without gram. We evaluated the total pollen concentration using the Instascope, and we were able to determine the fungal diversity using the spore trap. Now, following this, that was when we implemented our 24-hour control. Now, our 24-hour control was made up of several control measures, specifically an EPA recommended mold agent, an air purifier, a UVC lamp, and then natural ventilation. Now, let me be quick to add that this intervention only occurred in the bathroom, okay? So we allowed for 24 hours to elapse. Then we went back on the second day, sampled from the same area, collected the same information. Now, these happened in April. But then in June, we had to go back again to, do a follow-up assessment of whatever intervention we had done. But then prior to our visit, we had a third party go in there to provide an entire fumigation of the place. Now, we're quite happy about this because this time around, we not only were going to investigate or follow up on what we had done, but then we're also going to assess the overall mold concentration in the house because the occupant wanted to move back in. She wanted to know when it was safe for her to move back in. So basically, this entire post remediation phase was an avenue to assure her that, mold concentrations had been reduced significantly for her and her family to move back in. Now, before we go into our result, I first want to describe briefly what the third party did. Now, let me be quick to say that whatever information I'm putting out here was solicited from the provider's webpage, and it shouldn't be interpreted as me advertising or endorsing their activity. It's just to provide context for us to kind of understand what went in there. And later, when I present the result, things will begin to make sense. So this third party handled the mold in 4 steps. So similar to ours, the first step was basically about inspection, getting to know the environment, identifying issues, whether moisture was still an issue, identifying areas where there seemed to be higher concentration of mold. Now, the second step was the treatment step. The treatment step was basically made up of 2 distinct steps. The first one had to do with, similar to ours again, the introduction of an EPA recommended disinfectant, okay? Now, this is how they introduced their disinfectant. They employed mold. In fact, the picture does a good job. So basically, their setup is something like this. So whatever disinfectant is released, and then the idea, I believe, behind this, technique is that this will cover a wide area and would be able to reach, hard to reach areas that probably our traditional surface application won't reach. So I believe that's why they employed this method. Now, following this, they introduce a microbial agent, and then the aim is that these microbial agents would kind of form a bond over surfaces to prevent future growth of mold. Now, they finished their investigation up by taking samples and then sending it out to an independent, person to evaluate their result. Now, upon their result, when they find that remediation wasn't successful, they go back in to, perform or repeat the treatment until they receive required or desired result. Now to the moment we've all been waiting for, what our investigation showed. Beginning with the bathroom, again, because that was where we had substantial amount of contamination. So this figure you see here is just a size resolved distribution of aerosols in the bathroom, and this we got from the grim. Sorry. So from our distribution, this is, I'll quickly go through what this means. So this is result from putting in our 24-hour control. This is result from the very first day when we went in for assessment. And then this is result we got from the entire fumigation, the post-remediation result. Now notice we had several, observations. Notice how our 24-hour intervention recorded or brought down aerosol concentrations to, brought concentrations very low relative to the first day. In fact, our intervention saw about 80.5% reduction. That was the first observation that we made. And the second observation was that notice how the entire profile is predominantly coarse. By that I mean coarse fractions dominated the entire profile. So particles greater than 2.5, we realized that were dominant, and this accounted for 87.8 to about 97.5% of the entire profile. Now, the third interesting observation was this green graph, why it seemed the entire remediation process recorded much higher concentration relative to even the baseline reading. At this point, I just want to highlight this observation without necessarily providing an explanation to it, especially when we've not, reviewed other line of evidence. I'd also like to add that the green only gives us information regarding the total airborne concentration. It's unable to actually tell us the composition of the particles, okay? Now we are going to quickly review results from the bedroom and see if similar trends were observed. So in the bedroom, we realized that our intervention recorded or brought down overall concentrations to the minimum, and it led to about 89% reduction. But before I continue, notice how I said that with the bedroom, unfortunately, we didn't apply our 24-hour intervention. And so this reduction, this complementary reduction was kind of unexpected. But then later on, we come to understand why we seem to have recorded this complementary reduction. Again, we realized that coarse particles dominated the entire profile, and then they contributed to about 69.5 to 93.9% of the entire profile. Now together, whilst this provide information about ongoing changes in total airborne concentration, I would like to state that we shouldn't be in a haste to infer that this automatically meant that the overall microbial concentration of fungal load had reduced. Why? Because, as already mentioned, the GRIM only tells us the air concentration. It's unable to give any form of information regarding the microbial load or the fungal composition. And so it will be quite wrong to just capitalize or just take this data and extrapolate to mean that, oh, once we have a reduction in overall concentration, then it meant that the fungal issue or mold concentration had reduced. Now, to be able to confidently make those assertions, we would like to, investigate other line of evidence. And that is where the Instascope data comes in. Remember, we said that the Instascope gives us, data regarding the biological composition. So then we can confidently rely on such data, or we could combine data from the GRIM and then the Instascope to make reliable, assertions regarding decline or increase in the overall mold burden. So again, beginning from the bathroom, we noticed that the first day of, assessment, we had very high concentrations of mold in the bathroom. In fact, it was about 1,283 particles per cubic meter, which was quite high. But then following our intervention, it reduced from this to about 932 particles per cubic meter, meaning we achieved about 27% reduction, which was good for us because it was trying to tell us something. Now let's see whether similar results are recorded in the bedroom. So for the very first day of assessment, the concentrations were 397. However, on the second day, we realized that the concentrations were 399. Not much variations observed. And this buttresses our initial assessment. We actually didn't introduce any control measure there. So it's not surprising that, we didn't see any much, change in their concentration. Now, reviewing the GRIM data and this data is quite important because they actually complement each other. Whilst GRIM is telling us information regarding changes in the overall airborne concentration, this is actually telling us exact changes that is going on in the microbial world. So together, we can confidently say that indeed our intervention sort of brought about a decline in overall concentration and fungal or mold contamination that was observed in the residents. That being said, the question is this enough to make up our minds? Whilst this might be good, there are some limitations in that we are unable to actually know which spore type actually drove the higher concentrations, or right now we are saying there has been a decrease. Which spore type is contributing to that decrease? That is when the next line of evidence becomes, important. So this is the result that drives home our point. Result from our spore trap assessment is telling us the total spores across the period. So with this, we get to know the overall concentration during the very first day of assessment. When the third party came in to do their initial assessment way before we got in, and our day one of our assessment, followed by our intervention, followed by the entire remediation. So what you see, again, beginning with the bathroom, what you see here are actually concentration recorded from the very initial assessment that was done by the third party. So the overall mold concentration at that time was 25,480, which was quite high. But then when we went in there to perform our own assessment, the concentrations had reduced substantially to about 8,609 spores per cubic meter. And the only rationale or plausible explanation was that probably those little remediation that they did, like fixing the leaks, controlling the moisture, changing of HVAC system, could have actually helped in reducing the overall concentration. Now, notice how when we implemented our control measure, these concentrations moved from 8,000 to about 3,853. Also a clear indication that our intervention worked. Now, regarding the entire fumigation, notice how we now move from the 25,480 to 143. Now, are we going to observe similar trends in the bedroom? Let's find out. So initial assessment way before we entered showed that in the bedroom they had about 13,280 spores per cubic meter. But then before we started, these concentrations had reduced to about 9,729. Again, the only plausible explanation could be that their little activity, remediation activity, led to such reduction. Then following our implication or our introduction of the 24-hour group, we had this. This is where the question arises. We've already admitted that we didn't do any intervention in the bedroom. So why are we seeing this complementary, decline? The only reason could be that actually when you enter or when you go to the room, the structure is such that the bedroom and then the bathroom are closely, the orientation is such that they are close. And as already mentioned, when we introduced the intervention, we left doors open. So we are thinking that probably the radiation, the natural ventilation, the application of EPA recommended mold agent could have transported these effects into the bedroom. That is the possible explanation we can only give at this point in time. But then the good thing is that following remediation, this concentration had drastically reduced to about 5. Now we want to find out the exact taxa, the exact spore type that was present. Beginning with the bathroom. So when we look at it, we all can see the culprits. Aspergillus of penicillium drove the entire mold burden. So we realized that initial assessment, that is the one that was done by the third party, showed that Aspergillus was about 25,240 spores per cubic meter. That was wild. And for our first day of assessment, this had reduced to about 6,933. Following our intervention, it had reduced to about 2,893. And following the entire fumigation, it had reduced to 0, or should I say it had been extinguished. Now, from this profile, we get to know that Aspergillus did not only drive this, we had contribution from other, taxa. Okay, so let me be quick to say that we only represented or reported the dominant taxa. There were other spore types, but then we just didn't want to crowd the entire, mar our results. So we only reported the dominant taxa, but then there were other taxa that contributed to the entire profile. So as already mentioned, we had Claudosporium, Basidiospore, and the hyphal fragment also contributing. So initial assessments, surprisingly, there was no Claudosporium, but then during our first day of visit when we went, we recorded about 573. After our intervention, we extinguished them, and then following the entire fumigation, we still hadn't recorded that. With Basidiospore, initial assessment said there are about 120. When we went there to do our assessment, this had increased to about 920. Following our intervention, it had reduced to about 613. And following the entire fumigation, we had recorded 127 spores per cubic meter. With hyphal fragments, initial assessment showed that there were 40. First day of assessment, it had reduced to 26. And then after intervention, we didn't even record any. Now, let me be quick to say that in as much as we recorded or we chopped success in bringing down the entire concentration down, we also saw how there was an entire change in the fungal diversity, okay? So at one moment, we had Aspergillus dominating, but then at the end of the entire fumigation, notice how we didn't even have Aspergillus at all. Same with Basidiospore and same with hyphal fragment. And then we also, at the end of the entire fumigation process, we also recorded very low concentration of Ascospore and Basidiospore. Ascospore were about 16, and then Basidiospore was about 127. So together, we can actually confidently say that our intervention worked, and further, and the total fumigation also contributed to this. Now let's look at the bedroom data. Are we seeing similar trends? Yes, as we can see, again, Aspergillus topped the chart with contribution from Claudosporium and then Basidiospore and then hyphal fragment. At the end of our intervention, Aspergillus had reduced to 440. Entire fumigation had totally eliminated it. Claudosporium was present on the first day. However, it totally got extinguished following our intervention. Same with Basidiospore. First day of assessment, there were about 1,613, but then following our intervention, they reduced to about 1,000. The entire fumigation resulted in 0, or it had extinguished that. Same with hyphal fragment. So at the end of our assessment, we realized that together with the entire fumigation, the 13 spores that were present during the first day of assessment had actually shrunk or reduced to just Alternaria, which was about 5. So Aspergillus, Cladosporum, and other spore species had been extinguished, and the only dominant taxa at that time was Alternaria, and even that they were in low concentrations of about 5. Now the question is it just enough to know, okay, concentrations have reduced? Okay, we know the dominant taxa. Is it just enough? I'll say that at this point in time, it would be good to have to at least just, refresh to go over how these specific, taxa contribute to what we've seen, how they bring about respiratory issues, how already I've mentioned that our entire profile was dominated by coarse particles. What about them leads to that? So we are going to look at individual taxa. At this point, let me be quick to say that I'm not a microbiologist, and I don't want to admit that I'm an expert in this field. And so we are not going to go into in-depth, assessment of these dominant taxa. We just want to have a brief overview or background overview of what they are, where they are likely to be found, their size, and what they usually do once we get exposed to them. So beginning with Cladosporum. So Cladosporum is actually one common fungi that you actually see specifically in areas where there's water damage or moisture or dampness. And so indoors, you usually find them in our basement, in our bathroom, under sinks, around faucets, on carpets, on curtains, and on HVAC vents. Outdoors, you actually find them on decaying trees, dead plants, and then tree trunks. Now, usually they are about 3 to 35 micrometer in size. And so again, we now understand why our airborne data showed that they were predominantly coarse, okay? And microscopically, this is how you see them. But then in real life situations or in our homes, you can actually see them developing like this or growing like this, okay? Now, in as much as some data record that Cladosporum is not so toxic, most of them cause allergic reactions. And so for Cladosporum, you usually experience eye, ear, skin, and sinus infections once you have them in your homes. Now, the question I want us to brood over is how do we sometimes have these, species finding their way in our homes? Okay. Especially when you find them in the outdoor space. You know, when you have windows and then you open your windows or you even open your doors, they produce a lot of spores, okay? So once you open these, avenues, they have the chance to come in there either as a result of wind blowing them in, or they can actually, get attached to our clothes, on our footwear, or even our pet. And that's how we're able to transfer them from the outside environment into the indoor environment. The next bit we are going to look at is Basidiospore. Now, Basidiospore is slightly different from Cladosporum in that it's not just a specified single mode. It's actually reproductive spores that are produced from the fungi Basidiomycota, okay? A grouping that includes shelf fungi, rust, and then smut. Ideally, you find them in the size range of either 5 or 10 micrometer. And under the microscope, this is how you would see them. They are predominantly found in gardens and in forests and then woodland. And as I previously explained, they only have access into indoor space, either through our vents, our windows, our doors, or when we ourselves carry them on our clothes or on our shoes or on our pets into the indoor space. Now, most of these, spore types are known allergens. And so what they do is to cause allergic reactions when we get exposed to them. The next spore type I want us to consider is Aspergillus or penicillin. For the purpose of this webinar, I would split Aspergillus and penicillin. And by the end of this slide, we understand why most of the time they report them together. Beginning with Aspergillus, usually find them in environments, in soils, in homes and hospitals. But then one thing that shocked me was to know that our plants and flowers can actually be reservoirs for these kind of mold. Aspergillus are also known allergens, and some species can actually be toxic, especially for individuals with immunocompromised health, okay? So they are associated with diseases such as invasive pulmonary aspergillosis, allergic asthma, and aspergilloma. Now looking at penicillin. With penicillin, some school of thought would say that they are not overly toxic. Now, when I say overly toxic, I'm not saying that they might not cause harm. It's just that probably when you compare it with other species, their harm is relatively at a lower extent, okay? So yes, they're also known allergens, and they are found in diverse communities or habitats, and they are known to cause allergic reactions and respiratory illness. However, there's a good aspect to penicillium in the sense that they're actually employed in most pharmaceuticals and in food processing companies and in making sausages, and it's actually through the species that we had penicillin. So there are good and bad sides to penicillium. Now, when you grow them on plates, this is how they look like, and microscopically, this is how they seem to appear. That is for Aspergillus. But for penicillin, this is how they also look like, and microscopically, this is how they appear. Notice how they appear to be similar, okay? And so usually when you observe them under light microscopy, their morphology appears to be quite similar, making it kind of difficult to, segregate them into individual taxa, you understand? So mostly for when you collect them and you analyze them on a microscope, it's hard to differentiate, and so you end up reporting them together. Now, when the evidence converge, what are we saying? The question no longer is what individual instruments are measuring, but rather how they collectively come together to present a bigger picture for us to evaluate, the burden of mold. And so the takeaway point is that our GRIM data gave us very nice results. It showed us changes in airborne concentration. But then the caution here was that we shouldn't just rely on the GRIM because it only told you the composition. It didn't really tell you the makeup of whatever emissions that were present. It couldn't differentiate between biological and non-biological agents. And so again, in as much as we recorded reduction following our intervention, our 24-hour intervention, we needed other line of evidence to actually confirm or solidify this assertion, okay? So the Instascope did that. It was able to tell us that, yes, there was significant decline in overall mold burden. However, we feel not very much was recorded in the bedroom because, again, we didn't, introduce any form of intervention. Again, the spore trap told us that what was driving the entire burden was specifically Aspergillus, although we had other contributions from other taxa. Aspergillus was the main driving force. But then, interestingly, it responded so well to our intervention and that of the entire remediation activity carried out by the third party. So overall, our results worked, and the entire fumigation also provided further reduction in the concentration. Again, I would say that we just didn't record a reduction in the entire concentration, but then we were able to successfully extinguish some composition that were present, for instance, Aspergillus. So why then do we need to routinely monitor our indoor air environment? Okay. The first one is that it documents changes in indoor air quality, and then it confirms whether remediation has actually reduced airborne contamination, which we did. So for instance, we went in there was a complaint, we took our measurement, and the measurements, one way or the other, confirmed that there were higher concentrations, specifically in the bathroom and then in the bedroom. And after we had introduced our intervention, our method and measurement also confirmed that indeed whatever intervention we rolled out actually worked. The same was said for the third-party entire remediation that also occurred. We could confidently say that whatever activity that took place also impacted the overall mold burden. Another reason why we should routinely perform air monitoring is to detect hazards that are not visible during inspection. I mean, you'll be lucky to see Aspergillus niger growing in colonies in a particular space or Cladosporium forming on your vent. It would be nice to see. How about the spores that are released that we can't seem to detect with our ordinary eyes? You need air monitoring to be able to confirm all those, spores that are floating in the airspace, and then it provides objective evidence to support environmental assessment. Another bit is that it supports healthier indoor environment, and then it informs public health and building management decision. The last reason we ought to perform air monitoring is that it helps us identify areas requiring intervention. Like in our case, we just knew that the bathroom especially required intervention because it was the area that recorded the highest concentration. And then it also supports the selection and evaluation of remediation activities. Now, after all is said and done, our investigation is without limitation, okay? And then the first limitation is our inability to generalize our results. Why are we saying this? We only experimented or pilot tested this intervention and this two-story single family unit. We've not had the chance to populate the same intervention in other homes. And so it would be so wrong to assume that because it worked here, it's going to work in other homes like the duplex and the penthouses and everything. So as it stands now, yes, we've realized that it's working in a particular house, but then we cannot make that informed decision if it can, do same for the other type of residents that we have. The second limitation is how we fail to also collect outside data. We only were interested in collecting indoor data, and so it limited our ability to actually compare what was happening outdoors and what was happening indoors. Again, the next limitation was that only the bedroom and bathrooms were assessed. How about the other rooms? How about the living rooms, the kitchen, and then the basement? We couldn't actually assess all these rooms. And even with our intervention, we only applied it to the bathroom, and so we really can't evaluate the effectiveness even in other areas of that same house. So these are some limitations that we recorded. I would just want to express my heartfelt appreciation to all the collaborators who actually made this investigation and analysis possible. So to Pamanda, to Aaron, to Dr. Yadev, and Dr. Shankar, I would say thank you. Now, after this, if by any chance you're unable to ask your questions, you're free to reach out to either myself through this email or to Dr. Shankar through this email, and then we are sure to provide you with any answers to your question. These are some references that were consulted. Thank you, and at this stage, I would open it up for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Judith, for that great presentation. And as you said, 47% of homes are affected by mold. And so it's quite relevant to all of us. I have one question just to start from one of the audience members. They asked, what percentage of humidity indoors is considered the threshold where mold would most likely be present? So is there a specific threshold, or is it dependent on so many different factors, humidity,
Yeah,
etc., that it's hard to
actually,
say?
actually, Ashra has the recommended humidity for which all homes are supposed to have. Assistance, I don't have that range on top of my head. The person can always reach out to me and then I'll look for that evidence for. But yes, there are recommended, especially recommended threshold limits for relative humidity, especially from Ashra. Yes, for which we are all supposed to have so that we don't have this issue, coming into our homes. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, so I'll have that person reach out to you if they want
Yeah.
that number specifically, but there is actually an ASHRAE
Yeah, Ashra
threshold.
recommended, yeah. For
Okay,
relative
that's good to know.
humidity, not for exposure limits, yeah.
Of course, yeah. Um,
But then we all know that high relative humidity would definitely um,
yes,
lead to an increase in this,
100%. Yeah,
yeah,
if you have high humidity, it's very likely that you'll get mold in your home environment. Um, I had a question about the assessment tools that you were using, the GRIM and the different spectrometers. Are you familiar with any assessment tools that are available to consumers? Is there ever a push to kind of so people can like test mold at home? Is that something that you've encountered at all, or
Um,
have people asked you about that?
yeah, so mostly with these, if you want hardcore assessment, then definitely you have to involve the services of experts. Okay,
Mm,
I am not aware of home kits that allows you to test these concentrations, high concentrations, or to confirm these levels at home. And so if you really want an in-depth assessment of this issue at home, then I must say that involving an expert to do that is quite beneficial rather than, I know that there are some equipment that can give you an information regarding the moisture levels in your house, but then again, it doesn't adequately tell you much information like what we've gone through. It will just tell you you have moisture as an issue,
hmm
but it wouldn't confirm whether you have mold or even if you have mold, what are the composition or what is the
hmm
driving factor behind whatever observations you've made. So there might be low cost, equipment to do that, but then like its name suggests, they are low cost and you might not get the entire benefit that you require.
Yeah, you won't see the entire picture, and maybe you could also get a false positive or a
Yeah,
false negative, and you don't have the sort of thoroughness of an expert coming in and
yeah,
doing proper assessments and these multi-layer
yeah,
assessments that
yeah.
you've presented on.
Yeah, and
Um,
to add to what I just said, you notice how our method was complementary and integrated. We just
hmm
didn't rely on just one line of evidence because as I already mentioned, Graham was not going to, do everything for you. It would just tell you
hmm
that yes, there are higher concentrations, but then it wasn't going to tell you that these concentrations had biological aspect to it. So the concentrations could be dust, it could be mist, it could
Right.
be vapor. Yes. So you really need expert opinion to actually, first of all, decide the type of combination of methods to apply for you to
hmm
understand or evaluate the entire, mold burden you might have in your residence.
Of course. Yeah, and fill in the gaps that even a very advanced measurement such as the grim, it still has those limitations and there needs to be an interpretation to it.
Yeah. Hmm.
I had a question from Isabella in the audience regarding exposure limits, which Judith and we talked about this a bit with, there's such specific exposure limits for
In fact,
lead
you're the reason
and
I added that slide.
asbestos. Yeah, yeah. You see it for other contaminants in the home, and it's really specific. And there's no exposure limit with OSHA for mold, and that's a bit surprising. But I think you've also spoken to why that is. Isabella asks, I think I remember you saying there are no established exposure limits, OSHA, PEL, etc. Do you see standardization in sampling or exposure limits being implemented in the future? This seems like could create a gap in the way we evaluate mold in the home.
So the reason I'm laughing because I mean this has always been that question I'm asking. I mean, experts anytime I get the chance to engage them, whether we would ever have that standardized method. In
Mm,
a way, there are pros and cons to that question in the sense that now if you have a standardized method, then you might miss out on certain details because I mean, if you want to investigate this, use A, B, and C. What if you have other instruments that provide extra or advanced information regarding the investigation you are interested in? Additionally, because we also do not have these standardized method, it makes having that universal accepted exposure limit possible too. So it's kind of a hard question to answer. And
mhm.
at this point, I don't even know whether I am for or against having a standardized method because, like I said, there are pros and cons to that aspect too. Because there are times that, oh, you just want something quick, and so you think that doing a passive sampling is better for that evaluation, and it works for that purpose. But then there are also times that you feel, oh, I have this extended time period that I want to do that in-depth assessment. And so taking it a step further by incorporating an instascope or a spore trap or any of the equipment that are there would become necessary. Yeah, so sometimes what you have in there can actually influence the type of sampling you actually go for.
Mhm.
So hopefully with time, we might get something that works for all of us.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting thinking about the pros and cons of standardization and that if you do standardize it, you might miss out on some details. But if it's universal, it's easier to kind of codify and you're more familiar with it. I mean, it reminds me of the lead standards and the idea of like lead-free paint, which still often contains lead in it. It's almost like the standardizations make you a bit less likely to really investigate things and look deeper into the problem. So that's very interesting. We have a few more minutes for questions. If anybody has questions, they can add it into our chat box. Judith, I had a question myself. You talked that the one of the limitations of this study is you can't generalize, and now I'm going to ask you a question about generalizing it and putting it into different environments. Say there are a certain environment where you have these molds that show up and are intermittent. They come and then they go based on, say, a season. I'm thinking about in the Bay Area in San Francisco, we have these neighborhoods on the west side of the city where it's extremely foggy half of the year, and then the other half of the year it's very sunny. And I can imagine that people have really bad mold issues at certain times of the year, then it goes away. So how would you kind of think about these investigations in different environments? Do you see them working, or what are the limitations to bringing it into a different, seasonal environment?
So that was one thing that also stood out for me during the investigation and doing some literature review, how they are seasonal. And so, like you rightly mentioned, there are times that you seem to record higher concentrations, and there are times that there seem to be nowhere to be found. I mean, we have
Mm,
allergy seasons. I mean, that there are times where we have so many spore concentrations and we are reacting to words, we are coughing, we are sneezing and all that. So I would say that, like I already mentioned in the last but two slides where we were looking at the significance of air monitoring. I think during those seasons where they seem to be dominant,
present, yes.
that is when we should probably see to it that we incorporate more of these air sampling and put in some measures to protect us. Yes. As opposed to the times that we seem to be fine and not reacting to all these things. Yeah.
Yeah, you can't take that time as representative
Yeah.
when it's dry and it's hot and there's no mold present. Um, well, thank you so
So
much.
our seasons can actually be an indicator for we doing monitoring. Yes.
Yes, yes, and just the influence of the environment and the seasons that you find in a particular place. We're right at the top of the hour, so I just wanted to say thank you so much, Judith, for such a great and informative presentation. Thanks everybody for being here today. Look out for the evaluation form and feel free to email cohce@berkeley.edu if you'd like the slides from today. And we hope to see you at the next webinar. Hope everybody has a great day and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Bye.
Bye.